When I first moved into this neighborhood, everything felt just right. The streets were lined with well-kept houses. Each lawn seemed like it belonged in a home and garden magazine, and the neighbors were polite, always offering a friendly wave or a quick smile. It felt like the sort of place I've been hoping to find for a long time. Not long after I settled in, I decided to plant a rose bush out front to give my house a personal touch. I wasn't exactly an expert gardener, but there was something calming about getting my hands in the dirt, tending to the soil, and waiting for that first bud to appear. One rose bush quickly turned into two, and before I knew it, I had a vibrant collection of pink, red, and white roses swaying gently in the breeze. Early mornings became my favorite time of day. I'd slip outside just as the sun was coming up, carrying a watering can and pruning shears. The world was so quiet then, I could practically hear each droplet as it fell onto the thirsty soil. There was a sense of peace that washed over me whenever I knelt down to inspect a new bud or gently remove a faded bloom. It was like therapy in my own front yard, a sanctuary of color and fragrance. I never imagined that something so simple and beautiful could stir up trouble. Back then, I believed that in this pristine neighborhood, there was nothing to worry about. All I knew was that my rose garden brought me a sense of calm and belonging, two things I've been craving for a long time. And for a while, it truly felt like I'd found my perfect little slice of home. It all started with a single piece of paper taped to my door. At first, I thought it was just another flyer or a reminder about trash pickup. But when I peeled it off, I felt a jolt of annoyance and then disbelief. It was a notice from the Homeowners Association, signed by someone named Karen, stating that my rose bushes were out of compliance with neighborhood regulations. I remember standing there on my porch, reading the note twice just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. They wanted me to remove or drastically trim back the invasive plantings because they extended too far beyond a certain point in my front yard. The language was oddly formal, but the real message felt crystal clear. Someone was not happy about my roses. The next day, I saw her, Karen herself, marching down the sidewalk in a bright polo shirt, clipboard in hand. She stopped in front of my house, gave me a brisk nod, and introduced herself as the head of the HOA Compliance Committee. Without any warm-up, she launched into a lecture about maintaining the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. She even suggested that my yard was too flamboyant and didn't fit the established guidelines. I tried explaining how much my roses meant to me, how they become part of my morning routine and given me something to look forward to each day. But Karen just pursed her lips and repeated the same lines. This isn't personal. We just have rules here. Standing there, I felt both irritated and strangely embarrassed. I never had any run-ins with an HOA before. It caught me off guard that this bright, flower-filled spot I cherished so much was now the subject of complaints and official notices. As Karen walked away, I clutched the letter, my stomach twisting in knots. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of what would become a full-blown battle over a few precious rose bushes. What Karen didn't know, what the HOA couldn't possibly understand from a tidy set of guidelines, was how much my rose garden truly meant to me. When I first decided to fill my front yard with roses, I was going through a rough patch in my life. I lost someone close to me, a person who always said that flowers represented hope and renewal. In my darkest moments, I found comfort in the idea of planting something beautiful and watching it grow. Each time I felt overwhelmed by grief, I would step outside and tend to the soil, carefully place a new cutting, and patiently wait for that first bud to appear. It wasn't just about the end result, those blooming petals. It was about the process of nurturing life when I felt a part of my own had slipped away. The soft petals, the gentle fragrance, even the stubborn thorns reminded me that beauty and pain could exist side by side. Over time, working in the garden became my way of healing. When a rose bloomed, it was like a small victory over the sadness I carried inside. I loved seeing neighbors smile as they walked by, sometimes pausing to admire the blossoms. A few even asked for clippings to start their own rose bushes. It was a quiet bond, a shared appreciation for something pure and simple. So when Karen showed up with her curt demands and official notices, it felt like an attack on something more than just the layout of my yard. It felt personal, like a challenge to the memories and solace I had poured into this space. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about a few unruly rose bushes. It was about protecting the one sanctuary that had helped me find my footing again. A few days later, I got something more official in the mail, a HOA letter with bold text at the top reading, "Final warning, possible fines to follow." My heart sank as I read through the legalistic phrases. It spelled out all the violations I was supposedly guilty of, exceeding the number of allowable shrubs, non-compliant placement, and disrupting the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. They made it sound like my rose garden was some unsightly junk pile instead of the personal sanctuary I'd come to love. What really got to me, though, was the tone. The words were cold, with a not-so-subtle threat of escalating penalties if I didn't remove or drastically reduce my rose bushes within the next 2 weeks. They even hinted that the HOA had the authority to hire someone to remove the plants at my expense if I didn't comply. The thought of strangers ripping out my roses, the living memorial to a loved one I'd lost, made my stomach turn. I stood in my kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, replaying Karen's rigid voice in my head. "We have rules here." My initial annoyance transformed into real worry. Could they really come onto my property and tear out something so precious to me? Where was the empathy, or even basic human decency, in all this? That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing my yard, stripped of color and life, the soil bare and scarred. The dread gnawed at me, and I knew I'd have to face Karen and again. But this time, I wasn't going to just politely listen and nod. I was determined to find a way to protect my roses, no matter what it took. Despite my fear and frustration, I tried to handle things diplomatically. The very next morning, I called a number listed on the HOA notice and asked for a meeting. After a few minutes on hold, Karen came on the line, sounding as brisk as ever. I explained that I wanted to discuss possible solutions, maybe trimming back the roses, installing a small fence, anything to keep the garden while respecting the rules. There was a moment of silence on her end, and then a clipped response, "We'll hear your proposal, but the guidelines are non-negotiable." A wave of relief and anxiety hit me all at once. At least she was willing to talk, but the way she emphasized non-negotiable made it clear she wasn't planning to cut me much slack. Still, I had no choice but to try. The garden meant too much to give up without a fight. We agreed to meet on Saturday morning, right in my front yard, so she could survey the situation. By the time she arrived, clipboard tucked under her arm, wearing the same no-nonsense expression as before, I'd already pruned back the most overgrown roses and tidied the edges around the beds. I even moved a few pots to create a clearer boundary, hoping to show good faith. As we walked through the garden, I carefully explained why these roses were so important to me. I told her about the emotional significance, about how gardening helped me cope with a painful chapter of my life. I offered to fence the area or keep the bushes at a specific height if that would help meet the HOA requirements. Karen listened, scribbling notes as I spoke, but her face was impossible to read. When I finished, she flipped a page on her clipboard and referred to some official document. "We'll consider your request," she said tersely. "But if the board decides you're still out of compliance, you'll have 7 days to correct it or risk fines." With that, she snapped her pen closed and left without so much as a friendly goodbye. I stood among my roses, the gentle scent and vibrant petals at odds with a knot of tension growing in my chest. I was trying my hardest to be reasonable and follow the rules, but deep down, I had a sinking feeling that reason alone might not be enough for Karen or the board. The battle, it seemed, was far from over. A few days passed, and I heard nothing from Karen or the board. Part of me hoped my willingness to prune and tidy might sway their decision. But then I started noticing something odd, a gray sedan slowly cruising by my house several times a day. Sometimes the driver, who I swore was Karen, would even stop and snap a quick photo before driving off. It was unsettling, like I was under surveillance for simply having a garden. Then came another HOA notice. This time, it wasn't a polite warning, but a stiffly worded directive. It stated that the board had met and deemed my compromise efforts insufficient. They demanded I remove or severely cut back most of my rose bushes by the end of the week. If I didn't comply, the letter threatened the HOA would hire a landscaping service to do it for me and send me the bill. I felt anger and fear all mixed together in the pit of my stomach. How was I supposed to cope with such aggressive tactics? Did they really think I'd back down just because they were throwing around fines and threats? The worst part was I started to notice some of my neighbors acting differently. A few crossed the street when they saw me tending the roses, as if afraid to be seen chatting with the troublemaker. Others quietly offered words of support, but always in hushed tones, like they worried about being next on Karen's hit list. The stress wore me down, but it also sparked a new determination. If Karen was going to treat me like a rule breaker, I'd show her I wasn't someone who caved under pressure. My rose garden wasn't just a decorative choice. It was a reminder of hope and healing. And I would fight for it, even if it meant going toe-to-toe with the entire HOA board. Fortunately, not everyone in the neighborhood was on Karen's side. One afternoon, as I was carefully deadheading a few roses to encourage fresh blooms, my next-door neighbor, Lisa, strolled over. She glanced nervously up and down the street, then offered a sympathetic smile. "I just want you to know," she said in a hushed voice, "my husband and I love your garden. It's beautiful, and it brightens the whole block." She hesitated, then continued, "And we're not the only ones who feel that way." Her words were a balm on my frazzled nerves. It felt good to know there were people who saw the roses the way I did, as something that brought life to the community rather than an eyesore. Lisa went on to explain that several neighbors had been quietly rooting for me. Some even wanted to speak up at the next HOA meeting, but they were afraid of retaliation. Karen had a reputation for being relentless, and nobody wanted to become the next target. Still, a little spark of hope flared inside me. I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Over the next few days, I bumped into more neighbors who gave me discreet thumbs-up signs or whispered that they were on my side. A retired couple down the street offered to sign a petition, and a new family suggested taking photos of the garden for the local paper, hoping to show off the community's colorful spirit. Despite the looming threat of fines and forced removal, I felt my courage returning. Knowing that others cherished the garden too made me more determined to keep it thriving. It wasn't just my sanctuary anymore. It was something that resonated with people around me. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us spoke up, we could stand against the HOA's hardline stance and protect the roses I loved. As the days slipped by and the HOA's deadline approached, the pressure weighed on me like a heavy blanket. Every time I glanced at my rose bushes, once a source of peace and healing, I felt a gnawing worry that any day now, I might come home to find them uprooted. My nights were restless, my thoughts spinning with potential outcomes. Should I hire a lawyer? Appeal directly to the entire board? Rally my supportive neighbors to sign a formal petition? I decided to seek professional help. Through a friend's recommendation, I scheduled a consultation with a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Walking into his office with a folder of photos, letters, and notices, I felt oddly self-conscious. Part of me wondered if I was being overly dramatic. But when he reviewed the document, he frowned. "This seems unusually harsh," he noted, flipping through the stack of HOA letters. "Threatening to remove your plants at your expense is a big step, especially if there's no immediate hazard or major violation." He asked for more background, so I told him about the emotional importance of my garden and how I tried to compromise. I felt my voice waver when I described the nights I spent worrying that everything I'd built could be stripped away. He listened intently, then nodded, looking more determined than ever. "We have options," he said, tapping his pen thoughtfully against the folder. "At the very least, we can request a hearing where you can present your case before the full board. If that fails, we can challenge the HOA's interpretation of the rules in court. It's not always an easy path, but if you're willing to stand your ground, there are ways to fight this." Walking out of his office, I felt a glimmer of hope. Yes, this was still a battle, but I now had someone in my corner who understood the legal side of things. The support I'd been receiving from neighbors and even perfect strangers who'd heard about my situation reminded me that I wasn't alone. With a renewed resolve, I headed back to my house. I paused at the front gate, taking in the rows of roses swaying gently in the late afternoon sun. I gently ran a hand over a soft pink bloom, thinking of how much these flowers meant to me. Let Karen come with her threats. Let the HOA impose their rules. I wasn't about to let them bulldoze the one thing that had helped me heal. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one, and I wasn't planning on backing down. A week later, I found myself in the bright, overly air-conditioned conference room where the HOA held its monthly board meetings. My attorney sat beside me, tapping a pen against his notepad, while Karen presided at the head of a long table. A few other board members sat around her, each with their own stack of papers and a polite but cautious expression. The moment I walked in, I noticed a cluster of neighbors lining the back wall, quietly filling seats meant for observers. Some were familiar faces, friend who had offered me comforting words about my roses, while others I recognized only in passing. They didn't say much, but their presence alone made my heart swell. It felt good to know I wasn't facing this alone. Karen wasted no time in calling the meeting to order. She read out a list of agenda items in a clipped tone, saving my case for last. When it finally came up, she launched into a formal statement about community standards and the unacceptable scope of my rose garden. At one point, she rattled off how many inches beyond the approved boundary my plants supposedly reached, as if every inch was a personal affront to the entire neighborhood. When it was my turn to speak, I took a calming breath. My attorney gestured for me to begin, so I did, telling the board exactly how much these roses meant to me, about the healing process they represented, and how I tried to be flexible by pruning and rearranging. I also pointed out that no one else had complained but Karen, and that in fact, several neighbors actually enjoyed the garden. A ripple of murmurs moved through the spectators. I noticed a couple of the board members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. One of them cleared his throat and admitted he'd seen my roses and found them lovely. Another said she had no idea there was such a strict boundary rule in place. Karen's expression tightened. She insisted the guidelines were there for a reason, citing neighborhood uniformity and property values. I could feel her frustration rising, like she hated that the others seemed to be wavering. Every time she tried to wrap things up or revert to legal jargon, my attorney calmly refuted her points, showing that the HOA regulations allowed for aesthetic variation as long as it didn't cause safety issues or encroach onto public property. By the time the discussion was over, Karen was red in the face. But there was no immediate verdict. The board members exchanged glances and agreed they needed more time to review the photos, petitions, and my willingness to cooperate. They promised a decision in writing within a week. As I left that room, I saw small nods and hushed words of support from the crowd. I wasn't sure which way the board would lean, but the conversation had been eye-opening for everyone. Karen might have been the loudest voice, but it was clear she wasn't the only one who mattered. And as I stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun, I felt a cautious optimism blooming inside me, much like the roses waiting back home in my garden. A few days passed, and I tried to push the meeting out of my mind. Every morning, I still went outside to tend my roses, watering, pruning stray leaves, checking for any sign of pests. It felt weirdly normal, like this giant question mark didn't hang over my head. But every time the mail arrived or the phone rang, my stomach knotted, bracing for the board's decision. Finally, a letter showed up in my mailbox. I recognized the HOA's logo immediately. My hand shook a little as I ripped it open. Inside was a brief but official notice. The board had reviewed the evidence and testimonials, and while they wanted me to comply with height and boundary guidelines, they would not require the removal of my entire rose garden. They encouraged me to work with the landscape committee to develop a mutually acceptable design plan, a fancy way of saying they'd allow the roses if I kept them tidy and within a certain perimeter. Relief washed over me, but was tempered by a touch of caution. I knew Karen wouldn't be thrilled about this compromise. Sure enough, later that day, I spotted her walking by, glaring at my yard with a face like thunder. She shot me a single icy glance before continuing on her way without a word. Nevertheless, I felt hopeful. Maybe this was the start of a real solution. Over the following week, I met with one of the landscape committee members who was far more open-minded than Karen. We agreed on minor adjustments, trimming the bushes so they didn't spill over the walkway and adding a low border fence to define the flower beds. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed me to keep the heart of my rose garden intact. With each new blossom that opened, I felt a surge of gratitude. The threat of losing my sanctuary had nearly undone me, but I'd managed to defend it, thanks to supportive neighbors, a good attorney, and my own resolve. Even if Karen's disapproving eyes still hovered now and then, I took comfort in knowing I had a right to grow what brought me solace. And in that quiet early morning light, I leaned in to inhale the sweet fragrance of a newly bloomed rose, reminding myself that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how intimidating they might seem. In the weeks that followed, I worked with the landscape committee to fine-tune my rose garden, trimming back the edges here, adding a small decorative fence there. It wasn't a dramatic overhaul, just enough to show I was respecting the board's guidelines. My attorney assured me that this compromise should satisfy any lingering concerns, and most of the board members seemed pleased to see the matter resolved without further conflict. But as expected, Karen wasn't happy. Every so often, I'd spot her marching past my house, arms folded tight, shooting disapproving looks at the new fence line or the roses in full bloom. Occasionally, I heard rumors from neighbors about her complaining that the problem wasn't really solved. Yet no official notice arrived in my mailbox, and no more threats popped up on my door. Little by little, life in the neighborhood settled into a new normal. The tension that once surrounded my home eased, and I began to relax around my beloved roses again. On warm afternoons, I'd see other neighbors strolling by, pausing to admire the pops of pink and red bursting through the greenery. Some even stopped to chat, sharing how glad they were the HOA had found a middle ground. One sunny Saturday, I noticed a small group of folks standing on the sidewalk, snapping pictures of the garden. They introduced themselves as volunteers for a local community newsletter, eager to feature the ways residents were adding character to their yards. I couldn't help but feel a flush of pride. This place, once a battleground over a patch of flowers, was now being celebrated for its beauty. That evening, after everyone had gone, I took a moment alone among the blooms. The dusky sky turned the petals soft shades of pink and orange, and a light breeze carried their fragrance through the air. I thought back to how this all started, a single rose bush I'd planted to cope with loss and find a sense of peace. It had been my sanctuary when I felt most vulnerable. Yes, Karen still walked her rounds, clipboard in hand, casting a shadow of disapproval now and then. But standing among the thriving roses, I realized I'd won something bigger than just an HOA dispute. I had proven to both the neighborhood and myself that when something holds real, heartfelt meaning, it's worth fighting for. And I finally felt at home here, with each blooming rose a reminder that beauty, hope, and a bit of perseverance can flourish even in the face of the strictest rules. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected surprise. The HOA sent out its quarterly newsletter, and buried on the second page was a short article about beautiful landscaping efforts in our community. I nearly dropped the paper when I saw a photo of my rose garden beneath a glowing paragraph about how vibrant gardens can boost neighborhood morale. I reread that section at least 3 times, half expecting some hidden jab or subtle caveat, but it was actually encouraging. It seemed that beyond Karen's complaints, a number of board members genuinely saw the value in having unique, lovingly tended yards. I even noticed my neighbor Lisa had contributed a little quote, praising the warm, colorful welcome my roses provided. That same afternoon, I decided to walk around a block to clear my head. It struck me how, in spite of all the stress and confrontations, I still love this neighborhood. Families were out on their porches, kids riding bikes, the air filled with the hum of sprinklers and casual conversation. My roses had sparked a minor battle, but they'd also nudged people to connect and talk about what they wanted their community to look and feel like. I passed Karen's house. She was out front, adjusting a potted plant on her porch. Our eyes met, and for a second, I wondered if she'd have another snide remark or some new rule to wave in my face. Instead, her mouth tightened, and she gave a stiff nod. No words, just a brief acknowledgement. It wasn't exactly neighborly warmth, but it felt like a quiet truce. Maybe she'd realized that the rest of the board and much of the neighborhood had softened their stance. Or maybe she just ran out of ways to push me around once the board approved my garden plan. When I got back home, I paused at my gate and glanced at the rows of roses, still bright and full under the afternoon sun. It was hard to believe how close I'd come to losing them, and how that fight had unfolded into such a roller coaster of worry, anger, and determination. Yet here they stood, thriving as if nothing had happened. I let myself smile, a wave of gratitude rolling through me. The roses weren't just flowers. They were a symbol of standing up for something important, of finding community support when I needed it most, and of discovering my own resilience in the face of intimidation. I might not have won everyone over, Karen being a prime example, but in the end, I protected what mattered to me. And that, I realized, was worth every last thorn. Time passed, and life in the neighborhood found its usual rhythm again. Summer arrived in full bloom, and my rose garden exploded into a sea of vivid color. I spent many a late afternoon simply sitting on my porch, sipping iced tea and inhaling the gentle fragrance drifting on a breeze. It felt good to finally enjoy my yard without the shadow of an impending HOA crackdown. One evening, a young couple I'd never spoken to before stopped by. They complimented the roses and asked if they could take a few pictures for their upcoming wedding, which they planned to hold in a nearby park. I was surprised and touched. Here was a moment that reminded me why I'd fought so hard in the first place. My garden had become a source of joy, not just for me, but for anyone who passed by. After I agreed, they stood among the blossoms, beaming as they snapped photos on their phone. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the petals, and a couple of neighbors strolling by paused to watch, smiling at the impromptu photo session. I caught Lisa's eye across the street, and she gave me a thumbs up. It was a quiet, communal moment, where everyone seemed connected by something simple and beautiful. In that soft golden light, I let my mind wander back to the early, difficult days. Karen's snide comments, the official notices, the threat of losing it all. How close I'd come to giving in just to avoid the stress. But I hadn't, and seeing these small, uplifting moments unfold in my front yard felt like the best reward I could ask for. No one could say my roses didn't belong anymore. They had become part of the neighborhood's charm, adorned in a local newsletter, the backdrop for a happy couple's photos, and a conversation starter among new friends. Sure, I still spotted Karen skulking around sometimes, clipboard in tow, but her influence had waned considerably. The rest of the community had spoken, and they'd chosen to embrace the touch of individuality and color I'd brought to my corner of the block. I sat on my porch after the couple left, watching the last rays of sun dip below the horizon. The hum of crickets rose in the twilight, and the roses seemed to glow faintly against the darkening sky. I couldn't help but smile at how a garden, born from my own need for healing, had weathered the storm of rules and regulations and come out thriving. It was a reminder that sometimes standing up for what you love is exactly the step needed to transform not just your own life, but the lives of those around you, one bloom at a time.